The lethal enemy of barbarism isn't hatred, it's reason. And the people terrorized by ISIL every day don't need our vengeance. They need our help.
Canada ends its airstrikes in Syria as the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau continues to cement his foreign policy agenda for the country. So what's Canada's new global strategy? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. After nearly 10 years of a Conservative government in Canada, the Liberal Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is charting his own course. He announced Canada will stop airstrikes against ISIL in Syria. Trudeau also pledged to re-engage with the United Nations, even boldly stating Canada's desire to sit on the UN Security Council. Here to explain what's on the agenda for Canada is CCTV's Roy Ruttenberg. And Roy, how is Canada asserting itself on the global stage right now?
Well, Anand, last year Justin Trudeau really campaigned on a message of change. Change for Canada at home and change for Canada abroad. So already in his first 100 days in office, we've seen him try to distance himself from his image, from that of his Conservative predecessor, Stephen Harper, and at times even reverse some of Harper's positions. The UN example you mentioned is a great case in point. The Harper government had effectively retreated from the international body. Trudeau seems to be running towards it, trying to secure even a voice for Canada, and perhaps even a seat on the UN Security Council. He is, of course, a relatively inexperienced global politician. His first real step on the international stage was in November at the G20 summit in Turkey, and then just a few days later at APEC in Manila. At both gatherings, he defended his government's decision to bring into Canada some 25,000 Syrian refugees, and he challenged other, more experienced leaders on stage with him to follow his example. On the sidelines, Trudeau met with U.S. President Barack Obama to resolve tensions over a proposed pipeline linking the two countries. Just 1 week earlier, Obama had rejected the proposal after 7 years of reviewing it. It had been supported by both Harper and Trudeau. Well, then Trudeau announced, much to Obama's chagrin, that Ottawa would be withdrawing from the U.S.-led coalition strikes on Islamic State, something he suggested during his campaign. Canada's role there, admittedly limited, reflected Harper's more hawkish approach to global affairs, Trudeau clearly trying to paint himself with a different brush. And it's not just there. The Liberal government has cautiously distanced itself from a multilateral trans-Pacific trade agreement known as the TPP, which had been championed by the Obama administration. And last week, Ottawa lifted most sanctions against Tehran following Iran's historic agreement with world powers last year. The Harper government was opposed to that agreement. Anand?
So, Roy, what are the major foreign policy priorities for Justin Trudeau moving forward?
Well, I think first and foremost, you're going to see Trudeau try to redefine Canada's role on the global stage. We've already seen that during his first 100 days, and he's got 1,300 more days to go, so expect more of it. And we're also going to see him try to redefine what an international role on that stage means in the first place. Syria, for example, strikes or sanctuary for its people as a policy. In his throne speech, we heard him put a new focus on, quote, helping the world's poorest and most vulnerable. So you'll likely see a boost, for example, in foreign aid spending. It was slashed during the Harper days. Trudeau wants to restore it to what it was when his father was Prime Minister. And many still remember those days as the glory days of Canada and its global perception. He's also going to try to prioritize things like trade with China, perhaps even becoming the first North American country to have a free trade agreement with Beijing, which is firmly against TPP. And we'll see him trying to rewrite relations with Washington. He'll be here next month, the first Canadian Prime Minister to have a state visit in nearly 20 years, even though Ottawa is just about an hour's flight away. So that on and in itself is very telling.
Okay, thanks, Roy. That's CCTV's Roy Ruttenberg reporting. To explore Canada's changing foreign policy landscape, former Canadian ambassador to the United Nations and a distinguished fellow with the Centre for International Governance Innovation, Paul Heinberger, joins us from Ottawa. Ambassador, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for inviting me.
We just heard there from our reporter that the new Canadian Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, will put an end to Canadian airstrikes in Syria. Put that into some kind of context for us. How important is that? How much of a change is it?
Well, it's a change in role, but not necessarily a change in commitment to the coalition that's led by the U.S. During the election campaign, the then opposition member of Parliament, leader of the Liberal Party, said that if elected, Canada would withdraw its F-18s and end the combat mission in Syria. And in the interim, a lot has happened, of course, but the government, the new government under Mr. Trudeau, is keeping that promise. And on February the 22nd, the F-18s, our jet planes, will be withdrawn. But we will triple the number of soldiers that will be sent to Syria or Iraq to train local militaries, particularly the Kurds, but also in Iraq. And we have increased the amount of money we're spending on aid, particularly humanitarian, but also for education and the like, up to $1.1 billion. And in addition to that, we're taking in, we're resettling. At the moment, we've resettled about 25,000 Syrian refugees, and undoubtedly there will be more. So there remains a strong commitment to doing something about the problem from hell, the worst crisis since the Second World War in humanitarian terms, perhaps.
So is that going to be the kind of driving motivation for Canada right now, one of its core foreign policy principles, that it's going to put more of its energy, more of its effort into humanitarian causes when we have these conflict areas like Syria, rather than get involved in combat missions?
Well, I think that's one of the conclusions you could draw from that. I'm not sure that it, I think each of these sort of crises will be judged on its own, so to speak, merits. And the government is certainly not ruling out getting involved in combat. One of the things about Canadian history that is sometimes forgotten is that Canada was a major participant in the First World War and in the Second World War, and indeed in the Korean War. So there is a military history that goes along with the peacekeeping history that Canada has. So it will depend, I think, on what the circumstances are when the government is confronted with one of those choices.
When we look at Justin Trudeau himself here, are we seeing a new leader in Canada who is asserting a more individual foreign policy? Is he giving notice now that Canada is just not going to follow the leadership of, say, the United States or what other NATO countries are doing? Canada's going to do what is in its best interests and what it considers to be important.
I guess having been Canadian ambassador to the UN, among other places, I guess I believe that we were already following that kind of a foreign policy. We didn't participate in the invasion of Iraq in 2003, for example. And we did participate in the UN response both to Afghanistan and to Libya. So I think that what you are seeing is rather a shift from an almost reclusive, withdrawn, isolationist in some respects, foreign policy under the previous government in Canada, the Conservative government of Mr. Harper, to a much more engaged policy in the world on the part of the Liberal government. The previous government had poor relations with Washington, poor relations with Mexico City, not the best of relations with Beijing, cool and to the point of cold actual relations with Russia, although the Moscow certainly bore responsibility for that. And not very good relations with the UN and not very good relations with the Commonwealth group of countries. And so it took, the new government has basically decided to invert all of that and is seeking better relations with Washington, and that's already underway. Better relations with Beijing, better relations with the UN, better relations with Mexico, and so on. So that what you're seeing basically is a much more diplomatic-oriented, much more engaged government on the international scene than its predecessor was.
And in that pursuit of better relations with the United Nations, this is something that you would be involved with because you've been the ambassador to the UN. Canada is now seeking a seat at the Security Council. How much of a change is that?
Well, it's quite a big change, actually. The previous government sought election in 2010 for the seat on the temporary seat on the council from 2011 to 2012, and we lost rather decisively. The international community, the membership of the UN, preferred a bankrupt Portugal to a solvent Canada at that time, partly because of the policies the attitude we manifested towards the UN, which was one of considerable criticism, and partly because we walked away from our responsibilities on climate change, and generally speaking, downplayed and degraded our relationships in Africa. So we pretty much made it impossible for ourselves to get elected. The same is also the case in the Middle East, where our foreign policy basically took its lead from the Israeli government, from the Netanyahu government, which in the process lost us a lot of support among Arab countries. And that's another area in which the current government is reviewing policy, and I would expect to see some changes there as well.
And if we look specifically at Canada's relationship with China, Canada is looking at a free trade agreement with Beijing. What impact will this have on their bilateral relationship?
Well, it's I think a free trade agreement, and a lot of people more expert than I believe free trade agreement is the next important and logical step. We have a foreign investment protection arrangement with Beijing. Canada does. We have the two countries carried out a so-called complementarity study in 2012 to see in what respects free trade would be possible. And now it's a case, I think, of following up on that. And from a Canadian perspective, of course, a free trade agreement with China brings enormous benefits, but it also brings considerable risks because of the disparity of the size. Canada is not a trivial country, but we're a population of only 35 million, and that's a very in the jungle of international relations, Canada is one of the smaller cats.
Right, and in some respects, Canada's foreign policy will remain the same. I was looking at Canadian arms sales to Saudi Arabia. There is a deal on the table. That deal will go through under Justin Trudeau. It's going to be business as usual. We know that Saudi Arabia has come under strong criticism around the world for its human rights policies, but do these arms sales go through?
Well, I'm one of the people who criticize Saudi human rights policies, among many others. It's a country with an appalling record, in fact. And this is a very large sale. It's $15 billion worth of light armored vehicles. And they're somewhere between jeeps and tanks in their capabilities. And we, under the previous Conservative government, which put the emphasis on trade and trade policy, they managed somehow to persuade themselves that there was no significant human rights impact of such a sale. But for most Canadians, I think, looking at that sale, it makes them very nervous. And I don't think the last word has been said on this particular contract. The government has taken the view that a contract is a contract and it was entered into by the previous government. But still, I know that it's causing considerable reflection in the government, and that there might well be, there certainly will be going forward, a much tougher set of guidelines to follow for any future such sales.
Ambassador Paul Heinbecker, thank you for joining us, sir. We are going to take a break right now. Coming up, we speak to Canadians on both sides of the political spectrum about Canada's foreign policy future. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat.
He won't fight terrorists. Just when will he ever fight?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, Canada is doing what our allies need for us to do.
Welcome back. Some heated words on the floor of Canada's Parliament this week. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau took questions, and the Conservatives and New Democratic Party both came prepared. Well, joining me now for this portion of the show from Vancouver, Elise Mills is National Executive Director of Conservative Voice. From Ottawa, Sheila Gervais is a former national director of the Liberal Party of Canada, and Charles Doran is director of Canadian Studies at Johns Hopkins University. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Elise, let me start with you. What do you make of these changes announced by Justin Trudeau? You know, not everybody is on board, as we just heard in that exchange in the Canadian Parliament. And as Ambassador Paul Heinbecker just told us in that interview, this is quite a radical change for Canada, looking at the fact that Canada wants to put an end to airstrikes, wants closer relationships with the UN. What do you think?
Well, I heard the former ambassador's interview with you, and I had many questions and comments out of that, of course. But to start with airstrikes in Iraq, I don't know if it's a radical change so much as he made a campaign promise, not necessarily thinking he might be prime minister and having to stick with it, and has sort of put this incoherent policy together. So to give you an example, we're sending helicopters in there. Well, that's a pretty dangerous proposition to put in there, since the likelihood of helicopters being damaged from launchers down below, even if there is no long-range missiles, is quite likely. We're tripling the troops on the front lines. That seems to be combat. We're pulling out our jets just when, and our military leaders here in Canada agree, just when the airstrikes were making a difference, and we were standing with our allies. But we're not doing that anymore. We've increased the humanitarian aid, which is all fine and dandy, but you have to create a safe haven for humanitarian aid to be able to make it through. Mr. Trudeau, or Prime Minister Trudeau, was unable to answer the question as to why he would do all of these things and yet not maintain airstrikes, which are a far safer proposition for Canada. And if we're claiming that we do not want to go into combat, the airstrikes, or that we're trying to avoid a more heavy position in combat, the airstrikes would have been a better answer. When you get into his positions on issues around Syria, Russia, the relationship between Canada and Russia, for example,
right,
where he has taken a more bended knee approach with Russia, those issues become concerning. Looking at what's happened with Iran this past week, Mr. Trudeau has been absolutely silent on the behaviors around the Iranian leadership as well.
Okay, let me go to Sheila. Sheila, the interim leader of the opposition Conservative Party, says Trudeau's decision would, and she was talking specifically about the decision to stop airstrikes in Syria, would, and I'm quoting her, said, would blunt the sharp end of the spear in the fight against ISIS and disappoint allies. It's a point that Elise just made as well. The airstrikes, as Elise told us, is making a difference right now and is helping the allies. Do you believe that to be the case?
Well, I think there are a number of things that are wrapped up in there. The fact that Canada will be changing certain aspects of its involvement in the quote-unquote fight against ISIS does not mean that bombing will be discontinued. There are other members of the alliance that will be taking up the bombing mission. So the airstrikes will continue. It's simply that Canada's involvement in that aspect of the fight will not continue. Canada's involvement in the airstrike mission was about 5% of the airstrikes. We had 6 fighter jets involved. We will be involved militarily in many, many other aspects that bolster what Canadians believe to be their interests in the region. So it's a little disingenuous to say that the only way that ISIL and terrorism in general, because it's not only ISIL that we need to be looking at, but it's a bit disingenuous to say that the only way that we can combat them or fight them is from the air, dropping bombs.
Okay, let me get Charles into this. Charles, is the policy laid out by Justin Trudeau a clear policy, or is it, as Elise told us, incoherent?
Well, first of all, it's a traditional policy for the Liberal Party to emphasize foreign assistance and humanitarian kinds of considerations. So if you look at the history of the party's position, this is not radically new. And what should be emphasized, I listened very carefully to the Prime Minister's question and answer period in the Parliament. And when somebody said, well, what happens if those helicopters, for example, get into a conflict? He said, well, if we're fired upon, we will respond. We'll protect our soldiers. So the events could, in fact, force Canada a bit to come off of this policy. I think symbolically, this is a significant change, nonetheless, in terms of its position.
Significant because Canada will not... I'll get to you in a moment, Elise. Because Canada will not initiate firepower, but will respond.
Well, because it is, in fact, not participating actively in the bombing.
Okay.
And in other words, the attitude toward force use is somewhat different. That is something that allies and so on will have to take into consideration. On the other hand, it's not novel or new for a Liberal government in Canada to take this kind of position.
Okay, Elise, go ahead.
I don't disagree with the last point there as well, but if I can, mention that, for example, it's a very trite comment to say, well, we'll fire back. It is needless. We do not need to be sending helicopters in there. The vast majority, and I mean the vast majority of Canadians, overwhelmingly, month after month, show support for Canada's bombing missions, or airstrikes, I should say. So Canadians have many reasons for supporting it. One of them, they feel that that's their comfort level. Number two, they're proud of that contribution. And just to update our panel here, Prime Minister Trudeau and the Liberal government have already ceased those airstrikes without continuing on with the vote in the House. So that showed up in last night's debate in the House of Commons. But if I can also talk about, Sheila referred to the fight against terrorism. I think we'd be somewhat remiss in not talking about how this connects also with their campaign promises around our national security bill, Bill C-51, and some of the changes that they wanted to make, and that they've been relatively silent about that. We need to update our national security, and that goes into some of the discussions on the fight against terrorism. It's a domestic issue as much as it is a foreign issue for us in Canada right now, and there's a lot of pushing and pulling as to which way we need to go. And unfortunately, again, the Prime Minister has been largely silent about what direction he's going to take. And I think that the Canada's contribution isn't 5%. It was actually 6%. And I think Canadians have shown time and time again that they're very proud of that mission. And that's how the Trudeau Liberals have sort of positioned it. We're very proud of you, but it was so insignificant. And I think his detractors get a lot of traction when he makes comments like that.
Okay, let me get Sheila's response to that. Sheila, has the Prime Minister told us how he's going to fight terrorism, for instance, both domestically and outside the country?
Well, I think through his actions he is, and I might say in regard to Elisa's comments that Canada is looking at its overall security requirements and doing a review of our overall security requirements on a domestic front. Our Minister of Defense has today told us, and as a matter of fact, I might say it is the Department of Defense, it is not the Department of Offense. So we always have to be looking in Canadians' interests. That we will be maintaining the requirements that we have for members of the defense and the reserve. We will be looking at all of that in the context of an overall security review. So I think that all of these things will be coming together in the context of Canada's overall global policy that it's implementing. What I wanted to say in that regard is that you can see from some of the language that Elise and the Conservative Party are using that language is very, very important. So as I say, when we talk about Canada's defense policy, as I say, we're not talking about Canada's offense policy. When we talk about
Sheila, I
our
wasn't speaking of the defense policy. I wasn't speaking of the defense policy. I was talking
Well,
about
our
Bill
overall
C-51 and the national security, CSIS and CSEC, and the expansion of intelligence and surveillance, and what we do on the ground to stop the growth of domestic terrorism, and we also prevent those coming into the country that have ill intentions. That's what I was referring to. I'm not talking about military expenditures or decreasing the budget.
But these
Go ahead, Sheila.
But these reviews are underway. They are being addressed by Cabinet. They are being addressed by a Cabinet that is taking its lead from Canadians, from the direction that Canadians gave them during the election. And that is as true of, to go back to, the combat mission and the fight against terrorism and ISIL in the Middle East, where Canadians are the ones who said to the Liberal Party that, while yes, they were proud of the effort that Canada was making there, that they were not in favor of bombing missions.
Okay, Charles.
So
Yes,
this is how Canadian
I-
policy will be
Simply not
crafted
true.
in Canada.
What I would suggest is
Simply
this,
not true.
that events will in fact shape policy. And a good example is for example, with the relations with Russia. If, in fact, the dispute with the Ukraine, for example, were to heat up again, I think this would put Canada in a situation where it's going to have to participate for a lot of reasons, including domestic politics. So right now, it's possible to stake out a position that's different from the previous government in Canada. But world events may in fact force governments to take a kind of role in which Canada has to use force and so on.
Right, but Charles, looking very broadly at what pushes or what's going to be driving Canadian foreign policy, that piece that I mentioned in Foreign Policy magazine with Ambassador Heinbecker also said that the previous Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, put the emphasis on what it called hard power over soft power. Is that going to change now under Trudeau?
Well, I think that the Trudeau government would like to change this. They'd like international relations to in fact, accept a situation where soft power is more feasible. And in fact, it's good to emphasize this. Canada's a very well-liked country. But the problem is...
Soft power for Canada means more involvement in humanitarian missions, peacekeeping missions.
Right. But the problem is that when you get involved, especially with your allies, and they're hard-pressed and they need support, these policies could change. So I think what one is going to see is a government that, in fact, holds all of its options open over time. It must, depending upon what circumstances are going to demand.
And that's where we're going to have to leave it.
And a government that engages.
Very quickly, Sheila. I've got 10 seconds.
All right, I was just going to say, and a government that actually engages. So we don't close embassies, we open embassies, such as we're doing in Tehran, and we engage with countries, whether we agree with them or not, such as Russia.
I'm going to have to end it there. Sheila Gervais, Elise Mills, Charles Duran, thanks to all of you for joining us. That's all we have time for. I'm Arnold Naidoo in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.